Hello, and welcome to Week 2 of Texas History. This week, we will cover Spanish exploration of Texas. This is a review of the items I find important from Week's 1 lecture and slide deck. These review items are what I look for possible quiz and exam questions. To understand Spain's desire for conquest of the Western Hemisphere, we must first briefly look at how the nation of Spain came about. In early recorded times, most of Europe was controlled by Rome. As Rome started to weaken internally, northern Germanic tribes started to invade and conquer Roman territory, to include the Iberian Peninsula, also known as Iberia, which today we know is occupied by Spain and Portugal. Eventually, the Germanic tribe known as the Visigoths would control Iberia for roughly 300 years. In the year 711 AD, the Visigoths lost control of Iberia to the invading Moorish Muslims from northern Africa. They would rule Iberia for about 781 years. During these times, there was not an official Spanish nation. Like most European nations of this time, various kingdoms ruled parts of the nation. The kingdoms in Iberia slowly began to fight back against the Moorish invaders, gaining victories along the way. What sealed the fate for the Moors in Iberia was the alliance of the two most powerful provinces in Iberia, Castile and Aragon. This was sealed by the marriage of Isabella from Castile and Fernando from Aragon. They would eventually unite the other kingdoms on Iberia under the rule of the Catholic kings, also known as the Reyes Católicos. In 1482, they began a war against Granada, the last Muslim Moor stronghold in Spain, which fell and surrendered in January 1492. In October 1492, the Reyes Católicos granted and funded Christopher Columbus to find a trade route, eventually landed in the Bahamas, also known as West Indies. 20 years later, in 1512, the northern province of Navarre was absorbed by the Reyes Católicos, and Spain became a united country. By this point, you may be asking, Mr. Partee, this is fascinating, but what does this have to do with Texas history? Well, I'm getting there. As mentioned before, the Spanish began a conquest to retake the land. Just a quick administrative note. The term Spanish is referring to the ethnic people that make up the inhabitants of Iberia, not including the invading armies of the Visigoths and the Moors. It is easier to say Spanish than to list out each province. Of course, then afterwards, after all the provinces are united, then they would officially become the Spanish. Anyways, going back to the slide, the conquest to take back Iberia was led by the powerful kingdom of Castile. This Reconquista would redefine the Spanish culture. Over the centuries, as the Castilian Reconquista progressed, the status of the soldier became elevated in society despite class upbringing. The soldier became associated with the traits of courage, endurance, and honor. Since the Spanish were Roman Catholics, the Reconquista was seen as a Christian cause and linked the Roman Catholic Church with the government of the New Spain. The motto of the Reyes Católicos was one nation, one monarchy, one faith. With the victories by the Reconquistas over the Moors, a pride with being a Spanish soldier began to swell inside them. It brought excitement and glory that placed a premium on individual courage and pride. Fighting the Muslim Moors intensified their Christian faith, providing a spiritual motivation for further conquest beyond Iberia. After the ouster of the Moors from Iberia, the Spanish wanted to continue this tradition of conquest. As mentioned before, in 1492, Columbus's discovery of the New World would provide that path of glory the Spanish desired. Now, Spanish soldiers can go and serve God while seeking glory and riches for themselves and eventually Spain. So, a little lesson on historiography. Historians today call the motivation of the conquistadors the 3 G's, and that's God, glory, and gold. The Spaniards, it's kind of ironic because the Spaniards, having been conquered for over 1,000 years by the Visigoths and the Moors, would now be the conquerors. In 1493, Columbus started a colony in Hispaniola in present-day Santo Domingo. Further explorers started colonies in Puerto Rico in the year 1508, Jamaica in the year 1509, and Cuba in the year 1511. The natives resisted, but the Spanish were able to defeat them. The four ways that the Spanish were able to defeat them was: number one, they had better weapons, such as the sword, which was made out of steel, and the lancer, and then also muskets. Number two, they had ships that helped them to move long distances in a short amount of time. So, in other words, if a large force was on another island and it was needed on a neighboring island, they were able to move those forces in a quick manner, whereas the natives maybe had outrigging canoes and could move 2 to 3 people at a time. The third way that the Spanish were able to defeat them was the use of the horse. And what the horse does is it allows the soldier to move from one part of the battlefield to the other in a quick manner of time. The fourth way that the Spanish were able to defeat the Indians wasn't really by design, but by lack of knowledge of how diseases worked. And that was what they were able to decimate large amounts of the Indian population, because they brought European diseases with them, which they inadvertently did, not knowing what the consequences were of doing that. I just wanted to quickly go over why Christopher Columbus was commissioned by Queen Isabel and King Fernando to make the voyage in 1492. What this slide shows is it was simply just to try and find a shorter route to the Far East, particularly what is today known as China and India. The normal route was to turn south and go around the Horn of Africa and through the Indian Ocean to arrive at the Far East. Columbus, a skilled sailor and navigator, believed a shorter route could be found going west. It must be remembered that at this time that all the land masses on the globe were not fully known to seafarers, so Columbus wanted to find out if going west was the answer to a shorter route. As we know, he instead found the Caribbean islands, or what is known as the West Indies. They are called the West Indies because Columbus thought he had arrived at the Far East, not knowing he was the first European to chart new land masses. Believing he arrived in India, he called the people there Indians. Though Columbus never set foot in what we now know as the Americas, his navigational skills helped to set up bases for the conquistadors to sail to the new continents of North, Central, and South America. Some of the major activities for Spain in the Western Hemisphere included Balboa's discovery of the Pacific Ocean in the year 1513. Of course, we all know that one of the biggest land acquisitions by a conquistador was Hernán Cortés' 1519 conquest of what we now know as Mexico. Also in 1519, a conquistador by the name of Alonso Alvarez de Pineda explored the Gulf of Mexico. It is believed Pineda and his crew were the first Europeans to lay eyes on the Mississippi River and the Texas coast, though he never set foot there. On the bottom right of this slide is Pineda's map he created from what his survey of the Gulf of Mexico's coastline looked like. So real fast, I wanted to go over Cortés' conquest of Mexico, since this would affect the future state of Texas. In 1518, Cortés was in Cuba, and he was assigned to command an expedition to Mexico, but at the last minute, his superiors canceled the orders. In a mutinous act of defiance, Cortés ignored the order, setting sail for Mexico with more than 508 men, 1,600 horses, and 11 ships later that year. In February 1519, the expedition reached the Mexican coast. Some accounts says that Cortés had all the ships destroyed except one, which he sent back to Spain. This was to ensure that there would be no retreat from their conquest. He first fought Tlaxcalan and Cholula warriors, who then became allies with the Spanish. This relationship of mutual aid and trust continued into later times, and they often assisted them in their explorations up north into future Spanish territories, with future warfare and with colonization. After gaining local allies, Cortés set his sights on taking over the Aztec Empire. He marched to Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, and home to ruler Montezuma II. After being invited into the royal palace, Cortés took Montezuma hostage, and the Spanish soldiers plundered the city. Shortly thereafter, though, Cortés hurriedly left the city after learning that Spanish troops under Panfilo de Narváez was sent to arrest him for disobeying orders from superiors on sailing to Mexico. After defeating Narváez and his Spanish force, Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan to find a rebellion in progress, during which Montezuma was killed. The Aztecs eventually drove the Spanish from the city, but Cortés returned again to defeat them and take the city in 1521, effectively ending the Aztec Empire. In their bloody battles for domination over the Aztecs, Cortés and his men are estimated to have killed as many as 100,000 indigenous peoples. King Charles I of Spain appointed Cortés the governor of New Spain in 1522. Alright, so thank you for your patience. We finally reached the point in the lecture where Spanish conquistadors would set foot in the area now known as Texas and the surrounding areas. As previously mentioned, Panfilo de Narváez was sent by the governor of Cuba to arrest Hernán Cortés for disobeying orders by going to Mexico. Narváez was defeated in battle with Cortés, in which he lost an eye. Narváez returned to Spain and wanted compensation for the loss of the eye. In 1527, he was given the authority to settle and colonize the region between Florida and a point immediately north of Tampico, Mexico. This is essentially what we know today as Texas and the southeast United States. Tampico, Mexico is about 100 miles south of Brownsville. The expedition wintered in Cuba and landed on the Florida coast near Tampa Bay on April 15th, 1528. At the landing site, Narváez unwisely decided to land 300 men and about 40 horses from his support vessels in order to reconnoiter lands to the north. Due to a gross misunderstanding of Gulf Coast geography, Narváez believed his destination of Tampico, Mexico to be only 30 to 45 miles away, when the actual distance via the coast was approximately 1,500 miles away. Narváez's men, believing they were close to Tampico, fought their way north to the Florida Peninsula, near to where the mouth of the Waukulla River came out. This happened over a course of 4 months, always believing that they were close by to Tampico, Mexico. Unfortunately, at this point of the expedition, Narváez's expedition numbered just fewer than 250 men. The Spaniards decided to build rafts and leave Florida by sea in the hopes of arriving at Tampico, which they still believed was close by. They used whatever they had to make the rafts, to include their shirts and trousers for sails. For food, they killed a horse every third day. Each raft rose only 6 inches above the Gulf waters, so it was necessary to stay as close to the shore as possible. Along the way, a storm rose up, and three of the vessels sank. One of these was captained by Narváez, who was never seen again. The two surviving rafts continued west, landing near Galveston Island. In September 1528, Álvaro Núñez Cabeza de Vaca and about 80 and 90 of his fellow expedition members made it to the Texas soil on Galveston Island. And possibly it might have been Follett's Island near Galveston, near the city of present-day Galveston, Texas. In the spring of 1529, only 15 expedition members remained alive. The rest had died of disease or any other form of death. 12 of the 15 members decided to head south to try to find help in Mexico. Cabeza de Vaca, though, came down with a grave illness and stayed behind. 2 others joined Cabeza de Vaca because they couldn't swim across the numerous rivers and bays that they feared they would face. So, of the 12 that headed south, there was also an African among them, an African slave named Estevanico. He is credited with being the first African on Texas soil. Of the 12 that headed south, 9 would die. 3 remain alive, 2 Spaniards and Estevanico. They were captured and became slaves of the Coahuiltecan Indians. Back at the shipwreck site, Cabeza de Vaca recovered from his illness. He and the two other Spaniards traded with nearby Indians for supplies. Cabeza de Vaca was also able to receive food in exchange for his treatment of sick and injured Indians. By 1532, one of the Spaniards with Cabeza de Vaca had died. Cabeza de Vaca was able to convince the other Spaniard to move down the coast toward Mexico despite the Spaniards' fear of swimming. Around present-day Matagorda Bay, they encountered the Cavinan Indian tribe, which was possibly a band of the Karankawas, who immediately threatened to kill them. Cabeza de Vaca's companion was intimidated by these threats, and so then he hooked up with some Indian women and was never seen again. Miraculously, the Indians told Cabeza de Vaca about 3 Christians like him, living with other Indians nearby. Cabeza de Vaca was taken there and reunited with the 2 Spaniards and Estevanico from the original 12 that had left years earlier. The 4 remaining survivors remained enslaved by the Coahuiltecans for 18 months until their escape in the summer of 1534. As they escaped and moved south, they feared running into further hostile Indian tribes by the Rio Grande. So then they decided to turn west in the hopes of running into fellow Spaniards. Finding evidence of Spanish presence the further west they went, they continued on, eventually arriving at the Pacific Ocean. Finally, they were found by a group of Spanish traders that led them down the Pacific coast to Mexico City, arriving in July 1836. This was 8 years after the Spaniards had landed in Tampa Bay, Florida. This is a map believed to be the 2,400-mile route that Cabeza de Vaca and his 3 companions took to reach Mexico City. Present-day cities and political boundaries are included to provide reference of where it is they went. Cabeza de Vaca wrote an excellent account of his journeys, which provides great insight into early Texas Indians. Unfortunately for Estevanico, he was killed in present-day New Mexico by Zuni Indians while guiding an expedition in 1539. Despite sometimes being mistreated by the Texas Indians, Cabeza de Vaca argued that Spanish colonists should deal fairly with native populations. His ideas were unpopular with settlers, and he was sent back to Spain. Spanish authorities wanted to act on Cabeza de Vaca's writings and oral interpretations of what he said he has seen on his 2,400-mile track north to Mexico City, especially what he claimed were the 7 golden cities of Cibola. So in January 1540, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado was appointed to lead an expedition north to check out these claims. The expedition included 1,000 men, 1,500 horses and mules, and also included cattle, sheep, and pigs for eating. In April 22nd, 1540, Coronado's expedition begins moving along the west coast of Mexico. He was assigned 2 vessels that were sent up to mirror them on the coastline to provide them support. On this slide, I wanted to explain quickly why Coronado would want to move along the Pacific coastline. Mainly, the reason is that there's large mountain ranges in the middle of Mexico called the Sierra Madre mountain ranges. And in between those mountain ranges is a place called the Mexican Plateau, which is very arid. People normally move either along the Pacific coastline or along the Gulf of Mexico to try to avoid the large mountain ranges. It wouldn't be until later on that a path was found in between the mountain ranges through the Mexican Plateau that took travelers from Mexico City to El Paso and up to Santa Fe. And this road would be called the El Camino Real del Norte, which we'll cover later on in a future slide. So going back to the Coronado Expedition, in July of 1540, the expedition encountered a group of Zuni Indians, what is now New Mexico. Vasquez de Coronado and his men soon clashed with the Zunis and took over the Zuni village. Disappointed by the expedition's failure to find a golden city, he decided to send his men out in different directions to investigate further. One group became the first Europeans to see the Grand Canyon. Coronado spent that winter in a community made of several Pueblo Indian villages between present-day Santa Fe and Albuquerque. In April 1541, Coronado had a fallen out with the local people over supplies, so he set out heading east over the Pecos River in search of a city called Quivira. They continued their search through what is now Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas before giving up their quest. It is believed that he went through the Texas Panhandle through the Palo Duro and Tule Canyons. Despite not having much to show for his expedition, Coronado did provide valuable information about Native Americans, the land up north, and the resources there, or the lack of, especially gold. In spring of 1542, Coronado decided to return to Mexico along the Pacific coast that he took getting up there. This is a map showing the route that the Coronado Expedition took. The next 3 slides will highlight 3 Spanish explorers that helped to explore Texas. Each expedition added knowledge and understanding of the area now known as Texas. Even though they're not well known as Coronado de Vaca, it's still worth noting that they did help contribute to what we know today as Texas. The first honorable mention that I want to talk about is Hernando de Soto. In May 1539, de Soto was ordered to head out from Cuba to Tampa Bay with 10 ships and 700 men. In the spring of 1540, after landing in Tampa Bay, de Soto led his men north through Georgia, the Carolinas, and Tennessee. With no success finding gold there, the Spaniards decided to head back south towards the modern-day Alabama and its coastline to rendezvous with their ships. Unfortunately, in October 1540, a large Indian contingency met up with them near present-day Mobile, Alabama, and a bloody battle ensued. After a month's rest, de Soto made the decision to turn northward again and head inland in search of more treasure. In mid-1541, the Spaniards sighted the Mississippi River. They crossed it and headed into Arkansas and Louisiana, then headed back to the Mississippi River. De Soto took ill with a fever and died on May 21, 1542, near Faraday, Louisiana. His successor, Luis de Moscoso, led the remnants of the expedition into the northeast portion of Texas, trying to get to Mexico. The rough Texas terrain convinced them to give up this idea, and so then they decided to turn around and head back towards the Mississippi River. After building rafts, the expedition floated down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico and reached Mexico in 1543, roughly almost 4 years after landing in Tampa Bay. What's so important about this expedition is that it's the first time that a Spanish explorer had traveled between Spanish Florida and Spanish Texas on land. The second conquistador that I like to give an honorable mention to is Antonio de Espejo. It was 40 years before explorers returned to the northern boundaries of Spain's territories again, and this is mostly due to Coronado's negative reports of not finding gold up there. But in November 1582, the Espejo expedition set out from Mexico City not to find gold, but to find 2 missing friars who had traveled to northern New Mexico to convert American Indians. On his travel up north, the Espejo expedition learned that the 2 friars that they were going after had been killed by the Indians. Despite this knowledge, he continued on north to the areas of northern New Mexico and eastern New Mexico into Texas. So when they reached northern New Mexico, they then made a beeline to the eastern New Mexico until they hit the Pecos River. He and his men followed the Pecos River south and until they crossed the present-day Texas. It was here that they were welcomed by the Germano tribe, who acted as Espejo's guides for their journey back to Mexico. One of the members of Espejo's expedition, Diego Perez de Luxon, kept a daily record of their journey. His detailed descriptions of the landscape and American Indians encouraged further exploration and settlement of present-day New Mexico, but unfortunately not Texas. The third conquistador that I would like to give honorable mention to is Juan de Onate. It was 6 years after the Espejo ventured north that another expedition was formed to act on the information collected by both Coronado and Luxon. In early 1598, Juan de Onate led an expedition to settle present-day New Mexico. Instead of exploring, Onate was ordered to establish a colony around Santa Fe. On his way north, he crossed the Rio Grande at Paso del Norte, the site of the modern city of El Paso. It was there that he formally declared all of New Mexico Spanish possession. After establishing his headquarters in Santa Fe, Onate decided to one more time try to look for the lost golden city of Quivira. And unlike Coronado, he didn't find it. And so what he did was he confirmed Coronado's findings that there was no gold, no jewels, no riches in the northern territories of Spain. His actions were important to Texas because it would discourage the Spanish from wanting to settle Texas because of the lack of riches there. But his path through El Paso del Norte showed that there was a roadway between Mexico City up to El Paso directly north, without having to go along the Pacific coastline or the Gulf of Mexico. This roadway through the Sierra Madres, through the Mexican Plateau, would be called the El Camino Real del Norte roadway. And it would be a crucial lifeline between Mexico City and Santa Fe, the northern colonies of Spanish territory. For Texas and for El Paso, the location of the El Camino Real del Norte going through the Rio Grande Valley made El Paso an important trading and transportation hub in future generations. Onate would be the last of the conquistadors to traverse present-day Texas. This slide is just provides some general information about North and South America and where it stood with the European powers. So the map on the left shows what lands were claimed by whom in sense of the European possessions in the New World. The map on the right, especially the top right, depicts territories that were under control by New Spain. It wasn't so much territories that were claimed by New Spain. It was territories where they had successfully set up missions, presidios, settlements, things like that up there. They actually claimed up to the Canadian border, but they didn't have anybody up there. A lot of that was due to the fact that there wasn't a lot of Spaniards in the New World, in New Spain. By 1560, there was only 20,000 there. They were relying a lot on converting the Indian population to Christianity and hopefully Spanish citizenship. But unfortunately, due to the unforeseen circumstances of bringing diseases with them across the ocean, almost 90% of the indigenous population died off. And by 1605, there's almost 1 million left. It wasn't until 1650 that the Indians had built up an immunization to the Spanish diseases, and their numbers would start to come back. African slaves were brought to the New World, but only about 20,000 arrived by 1553. One thing I wanted to mention that has some repercussions to today was the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas that was brokered by the Pope between Spain and Portugal about who controlled what. So to the left of the demarcation line was Spanish control. To the right was Portugal control. That is why today in Brazil they speak Portuguese. In terms of Texas, it would be almost 100 years before Spain would properly settle what is today Texas at the Onate Expedition. I just wanted to show some basic differences between how European nations settled new territory. And I picked the English versus the Spanish. And the big difference was within English, control of new territories was decentralized. In other words, it was the colonies were were established by private companies that got their permits from the king, and they were in charge of running their own little colony. Whereas the Spanish, they didn't do that. It was run by the monarchy. The monarchy assigned a viceroy in New Spain, and he ran everything from Mexico City. So with Spain, all the decisions were made in Mexico City. With the English, it was made in the local colonies, and then even in the local colonies, decisions were made at the local township level. Another thing the English did was the way that they would occupy territory was by divvying up the land between settlers, and they would farm it and work the land. The Spanish would send missionaries and soldiers and presidios out to new territories where they would hopefully convert the Indians to Christianity and therefore hopefully become Spanish citizens. The English didn't rely on an expensive professional army to guard the settlers. The settlers were responsible for their own protection, and so they had to form militias to do this. The Spanish, though, relied on an expensive professional army to do this, and they had to live in expensive presidios to carry out their missions. Another thing the English had going for them was they had smaller areas to work with, whereas the Spanish had pretty much half of South America, Central America, and almost most of North America. The problem was that, as we saw in the previous slide, they only had 20,000 Spaniards to do everything with. They were relying a lot on converting the Indian population to Christianity and Spanish citizenship to work the territory that they claimed. But in a little while, in terms of Texas, we're about to see what motivated Spain to quickly want to settle the rest of the territory that we now call Texas. Real fast, I wanted to talk how the Spanish controlled new territory. And there was 4 basic types of settlements that they used to do this with. The first one, and the most important one, was by missions. And these were religious communities and pacification centers. And what is meant by that is that this was where Indians were invited to come in. They would receive Christian instruction, and they would be taught how to farm and work the land. This was probably the most popular way the Spanish were able to try to settle the new territory. To support the missions and to protect them, Presidios were placed intermittently around the regions of missions. So a Presidio might protect on maybe 4 to 8 missions, where the soldiers would respond if they were attacked, or they would patrol, or they would provide convoy duty as necessary. And usually around the Presidios and missions, towns would spring up of Spanish citizens and Christianized Indians that stayed around these areas, and they started to form little communities. And to support these communities, enterprising Spanish and mestizo peoples started to move up into the areas and were permitted large tracts of land to run ranches where they grew mostly beef. And this beef was used to support the missions and the Presidios in their areas. So again, the 4 types of settlements that the Spanish used to occupy their new territory was missions, Presidios, towns, and ranches, or ranchos. The Spanish missions that were set up were mostly run by the Franciscan order of the Catholic Church. And the general purpose of the missions was to do 3 things. One is to congregate the nomadic tribes into a settlement. It was to convert them to Christianity, and then it was to teach them crafts and agriculture so that they could become self-reliant. The idea of the missionaries was to establish Christian towns built around the missionaries so that Spanish territory could be properly settled. The missions mission life was daily life was usually organized around prayer, work, training, eating meals, relaxation, and sometimes be celebrating religious holidays and celebrations. Once a mission was successful in its mission in converting a lot of the Christians to Christianity and turning them to Spanish rule, the mission was then secularized. And what is meant by that was that the Franciscan order of monks that has set up the mission would turn it over to another Catholic clergy that was considered secular. And what they meant by that is not so much that he was atheist or whatever. It was meant that he was not part of the Franciscan order. And so once the Franciscans were successful in their mission, they would bring another priest into there to run the local chapel. And so it was thought of that once this was done, that the Indians would stay around, form a town, become tax-paying Spanish citizens, and help to protect the Spanish Empire. As expected, there were problems with the missions. The missionary strategy was to maintain a strict vigilance over the life of the missionized natives. Unfortunately, that didn't go over well with the nomadic people or semi-nomadic people of Texas. They really didn't like living a fixed lifestyle. They were used to not growing their food. They were used to going out there and hunting for it. And that leads to the next part was they didn't like the strong regimentation of missionary life. They liked coming and going as they please. If it was time to hunt, it was time to hunt. If it was time to rest, it was time to rest. And so they had a hard time accepting the life of the missions. And as mentioned earlier, diseases hampered the indigenous populations of the missions. And so the missions had to rely heavily on new recruitment to keep their numbers up, because if they didn't keep their numbers up, eventually that mission would be closed down. And another problem with the missions was soldiers that were sometimes stationed with missions or stationed in Presidios nearby that would harass the Indians, causing further problems for the missionaries there. In this slide, I wanted to show the different phases of Spanish missions being built in Texas. The early phase only saw 8 missions built, which was the early 1600s. It wasn't until the 1700s that most of the missions would be built in Texas. The early 1700s saw 15 built, and the mid to late 1700s was 12 built. So roughly between 1682 and 1793, 26 missions were maintained for different lengths of time in the boundaries of Texas. And what that means is that 26 were up and running at any given time in Texas. One would close, another one would be built. So give or take 26 missions in Texas. In the 1600s, as the Spanish were moving up north, most of the missions were built along the Rio Grande. And a lot of these missions that were built along the Rio Grande would become bases for other missionaries to jump from Mexico into Texas. San Miguel de los Ideas is believed to be the easternmost colonial Spanish Texas outpost. It was a mission and a presidio. It was located near Natchitoches, Louisiana. It would at one time serve as the capital of Spanish Texas, and later on we'll cover that in a future slide. The first mission in Texas was established in 1632 near present-day San Angelo, called San Clemente. Some historians will argue that Corpus Christi de la Isleta in El Paso was the first mission, but for the purpose of this class, we'll call it San Clemente. This mission is believed to have been established where the Contra River and the Colorado River come together. It was a follow-up to a 1629 missionary trip where Franciscan missionaries ran into a group of Jumano Indians that requested Christian instruction. The mission lasted for 6 months before it was abandoned. And the reason why it was abandoned, it was just found to be too remote from the home base in New Mexico. The thing is about mission uh, mission locations in West Texas, they weren't run by authorities in Mexico. They were run by administrative offices in New Mexico, Santa Fe, New Mexico. So it was found that the distance between Santa Fe and San Angelo was too great to support this lone mission, and so it was abandoned in 1632. But about 50 years later, in 1684, another San Clemente mission in the general area would be established. An interesting occurrence that happened in West Texas involved what was called the Lady in Blue incident. A young woman in Spain, Maria de Jesus de Agreda, was born in 1602, and when she was 18 years old, she took vows to become a nun and was called Maria de Jesus. In the 1620s, Maria de Jesus would fall into these deep trances, and she claimed that that she could be transported to distant lands and teach the gospel to the natives there. This was called bilocation, where her physical body was back in Spain, but her spirit or mental being was somewhere else. And so she talked to her superior, her confessor, about this, and he got in touch with the Archbishop of Mexico about it. And so they launched an investigation into it and kept it on the back burner, hoping to hear more about this. Well, in July 1929, about 50 Germano Indians arrived in New Mexico and requested to receive Christian instructions. So as the missionaries were teaching them, they found that the Germanos had already knew a lot about the Catholic faith. And they said, "Where did you learn this?" And they said, "Well, the woman in blue told us about it." Well, another expedition, a Spanish expedition, set out. They ran into another group of Germano Indians, and they requested Christian instruction, and they were given it, and they found that they knew. And they said, "Well, how did you learn this?" And they said, "Well, the Lady in Blue taught us." Come to find out that about 2,000 natives, mostly Germano Indians, had received instruction from the Lady in Blue. Well, 2 years later, 1631, Fray Alonso de Benavides, a former administrator in New Mexico, had traveled to Spain, and he ran into Maria de Jesus. And he said, describe some stuff to me. And so she described things that were found in Texas and New Mexico that someone in Spain would not have known. And she admitted to about 500 bilocations to New Spain, and that she was indeed the Lady in Blue that the Germanos had talking about. So just wanted you to know that this was a story that was going on, and I can't confirm or deny that it ever happened, but it's something that you should know. Previously, we mentioned that the El Camino del Real Norte road went through a place called El Paso del Norte and established it as a waypoint and a trading point for travelers going from Mexico City to Santa Fe. And in the 1650s, a mission was founded there called Nuestra Senora de Guadalupe, and it was on the south bank of the Rio Grande in what is now Ciudad Juarez. Later, in the next slide, we'll go over this, but there was an Indian revolt in the 1680s that sent Spanish colonists and allied Indians down to El Paso to take refuge in the El Paso area. In the 1680s, when all these groups went down there, they held mass at the mission in a town called Isleta. And Isleta is believed to have been the oldest town in Texas because it was one of the first ones established. Also, the first mass was held in Texas at the mission there in El Paso. Moving ahead, in 1682, 5 settlements were found in the chain along the south bank of the Rio Grande. It was El Paso del Norte, San Lorenzo, Sanico, Isleta, and Socorro. By the 1750s, about 5,000 people were living in the El Paso area, and this included Spaniards, mestizos, and Indians. And it was the largest complex of population in the Spanish northern frontier. They went ahead and established irrigation ditches and a dam to control the water. And in 1789, San Elizario Presidio was founded to help in the defense of the El Paso settlements against the marauding Apaches in West Texas. So, as mentioned before, the Spaniards ignored a lot of Texas and settled New Mexico, particularly around Santa Fe and Albuquerque. And a lot of that was because they found a lot of riches in northern New Mexico, especially silver. So by 1680, roughly 2,800 personnel were living in what was known as the Pueblo country at the headwaters of the Rio Grande around the Santa Fe, Albuquerque area. Well, in 1680, the Pueblo Indian groups, Zuni group, the Sunni Indians, and other ones like that, were led by Chief Pope, and they attacked the Spaniards. And the Spaniards were overwhelmed, and so they escaped following the Rio Grande down to El Paso, and they were accompanied by friendly Indians that had allied with them. And when they got to El Paso, as mentioned before, they established Corpus Christi de la Isleta for the Pueblo Indians. And then the settlement of Isleta, the oldest town in Texas, was established for the Spaniards. Isleta was first located south of the Rio Grande, but as the river shifted, Isleta now became a part of Texas on the north banks of the Rio Grande. And so, as I said earlier, Corpus Christi de la Isleta was considered the first mission in Texas, and not San Clemente. But again, for the purpose of this class, we're saying San Clemente was. And so, El Paso. So with the refugees from the Santa Fe coming down El Paso, it became a huge settlement in Texas and a very important place for traders and other Spanish officials to locate. As mentioned before, the Spaniards didn't establish a lot of missions inside of Texas, but they did establish a lot along the Rio Grande in the early part of Spanish settlement. And one of the ones that they first established was Mission San Juan Bautista. It is now located near the present-day Guerrero, Coahuila, Mexico, which is 35 miles down the Rio Grande from Eagle Pass and Piedras Negras. It was built in 1699, and it grew into 3 missions. And it also included a Presidio and then a town built up around the 3 missions and the Presidio. It was called the mother of all Texas missions because it became a base for missions that were inside of Texas. It kind of became a supply base. It had great irrigation. It had great lands to farm. There was a lot of cattle around the area, and so they became like a headquarters element to support more remote missions inside of Texas. And it was located along the old San Antonio Road, which we'll cover later, and also its location near the Rio Grande, which was 5 miles south of the Rio Grande. It was an ideal location to cross the river, to ford the river, and so a lot of people moving from Mexico into Texas went through Mission San Juan Bautista. So, talking about support for the missions, to protect the missions that were inside Texas, Spain established presidios. And a presidio essentially was just a military fort. And these forts were generally responsible for protecting not just one, but several missions within this region. Settlers later on, looking for protection from the Indians, would build their homes near missions to also be protected by these presidios. And as more settlers moved up there and started building around the missions and presidios, this led to more formations of towns. And for example, as we covered earlier, El Paso and in San Antonio, which we'll cover later, Spaniards lived near missions on ranchos or haciendas and mainly raised cattle. the beef that they raised were supplied the missions and presidios in the area, and so we see the model for the Spanish settlement of their territories. They established a mission. Then later on, presidios is built to protect those missions, and as settlers move up, they build around the missions and the presidios for protection and for support. And then as the towns are built, ranches and haciendas are built around the towns that sell their beef to them. Like the missions, the Presidio construction had a timeline as well. Between 1716 and 1789, there were about 8 military presidios built in Texas. Some presidios weren't built in what is today Texas. Some were built outside of the present state boundaries that we know today. For example, the Los Adias in Louisiana was one of those. Even though at the time it was considered the capital of Texas, nowadays it's located in Louisiana. The 8 presidios in Texas were the Dolores de las Tejas, the San Antonio de Bexar, de Laurento, as I mentioned, Los Adayas, San Francisco Xavier de Gadito, and so Ahumada, Amarillos, and what's funny about Amarillos was that it was first constructed in 1757, abandoned, and then reconstructed and reoccupied in 1789. On the right, you'll see some pictures of what a presidio might have looked like. So construction of a presidio, it was normally built by material that can be found in the immediate area. Of course, stone was the preferred building material of use, but sometimes they had to rely on logs. And normally the forts were built in a rectangular or square shape, sometimes with walls as high as 10 feet. They normally, when the corners were built differently, because what they wanted to do was have the corners go beyond the walls. That way they could see all the way down there. So if there was an attack on the wall, they could shoot down the whole length of the wall. And so, like for example, the Los Adayas, they had diamond-shaped corners, as you can see on the bottom right, and you could tell that those would be able to cover their sectors of fire if an invasion was to occur. Buildings were contained within the walls, and they were usually tried to about 18 feet kept apart. And the walls, the roofs were made to where guys could go out there and fire their muskets if need be. Inside of Presidio, you would find storage facilities, you would find a chapel, and of course quarters for the officers and the men. Security was a primary concern, and so they only had one opening, which was the main gate, and it was always kept locked at all times. And sometimes there was a rear gate, but that meant you had to have a guard. You had to have more guards on the rear gate. So the less gates you had, the less guards you needed. And so, for most part, Presidios only had one main gate. As with the missions, there was problems with the Presidios. And so, what was found was the soldiers in these Presidios, they lived in considerable hardship and danger. In 1766 to 1768, an army inspection went around to the Presidios and found pretty much a lack of discipline. And this was due to 3 things. One was the soldiers were deeply in debt because they were getting paid late or not getting paid at all. 2 was their equipment and arms badly deteriorated and weren't being replaced. Plus, they found that some of the soldiers had not been trained on the proper use of their equipment. And thirdly, officers were profiteering by selling inferior goods to the soldiers at inflated prices, especially when the soldiers weren't getting paid on time. And so, as expected, this created very, very low morale. The soldiers who lived in Presidios often became the source of trouble with the Indians and were often in conflict with the friars. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, when you had a professional army, a professional army always accrued a lot of expenses. And so Presidios was one of the expenses. And so higher ups were always arguing how much Presidios they needed in Texas in order to properly guard the missions. Of course, the military guys wanted as much Presidios as they can to protect, and also the friars did, wanted as much Presidios as they can to protect all the missions. Whereas the accountants, the guys with the money, said, we can't afford all that. You need to go with half that number. So there was always a constant bickering about how much Presidios were to be built. So, as we mentioned earlier, there would be a European power that would give Spain a headache in the New Spain territory. And that headache came from a place called France. The new headache came from France in the name of the Salle Expedition. In 1667, René Robert Cavelier Sieur de la Salle went to Canada to become a fur trader and adventurer. La Salle returned to France and received a trade concession to build a line of posts down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico, heading out in 1682. In spring 1683, he made it down to the Gulf of Mexico, and he claimed all of Mississippi River for France. And he named the region at the southern portion of the Mississippi River, Louisiana, in honor of King Louis XIV. La Salle returned to France and asked permission to build settlements down the Mississippi River. It was granted, and so he was given 2 ships and all the supplies he could load, and set out to seek to establish the settlements down in the Mississippi. With La Salle was 300 soldiers and colonists, to include women and children. As what happened to the Spanish, La Salle got lost, and he overshot the mouth of the Mississippi by a mere 400 miles. Well, in February 1685, a storm rose up, and it shipwrecked one of his ships in the Matagorda Bay on the Texas coastline. Then that was because the reason why they were near there was because La Salle thought that the Nueces River was the Mississippi. And so they were floating around there, and then a storm came. One of his ships became grounded in the Matagorda Bay. They went ahead and unloaded their supplies and moved inland, where he got into a skirmish with the Karankawa Indians. And so the ship that wasn't grounded, he sent back to France. Whether it's to get more supplies or to get help, we don't know why he sent it back to France. He quickly realized that the Nueces River was not the Mississippi River. And so La Salle and others, for some reason, turned south and went down in South Texas looking for the Mississippi River. They realized that they were heading in the wrong direction, and so he turned around and went back to where the spot in Matagorda Bay where he landed. And so there he decided to make more plans on what he was going to do. Well, in January 1687, out of the original 200 settlers that remained on the land, only 41 were still alive. 4 of them deserted and went to live with the Indians. La Salle left a contingency of about roughly 24 people at a place called Fort St. Louis, a group of log buildings that they had built to shelter themselves, at a place on the present Garcetas Creek. And with 17 other men, he set out to find the Mississippi River and eventually head to Canada. And it was hoped that they could get up there, get a party together, and come back down and get the rest of the 24 people. Well, La Salle, he was kind of arrogant guy, and the French were already tired of him getting them lost and killing most of the party. So when they crossed the Trinity River in Texas, the men with La Salle murdered him. Of the 17 men with La Salle, 5 of them would eventually make it to Canada and tell the French authorities there what happened to the expedition. For the colonists, the 24 people that remained at Fort St. Louis, they were able to survive for another 2 years until about December 1688. Eventually, the Karankawas would attack them, and they killed everyone except 5 children, which they adopted into their tribe. In 1995, a great thing happened for Texas historians. Marine biologists that were searching the Matagorda Bay found La Salle's ship that had grounded there. It was called the La Belle, and it was preserved in the muddy bottoms of the Matagorda Bay. They were able to excavate it, piece it together, and clean it off. They found a lot of artifacts with it as well. Well, now that the remains of the ship is located at the Bob Bullock Texas State History Museum in Austin. If you ever have a chance to go see it, I would recommend it because it is fascinating. So going back to La Salle in Texas, the Spanish, they got word that the French had landed in Texas. It was feared that the French were trying to take over Spanish land, and so they weren't happy about it, as you can expect. Between the years of 1686 and 1687, roughly a year or two after Fort St. Louis was found, the Spanish was established. The Spanish sent about 6 expeditions by land and 5 by sea in an attempt to locate Fort St. Louis. In 1689, a Spanish governor named Alonso de Leon led another expedition. He was accompanied by a Spanish priest named Father Damien Massonet, and so they set out to East Texas to find Fort St. Louis. In an attempt to show the French that Texas belonged to Spain, the Spanish started to build missions and presidios in northeast Texas. They were not aware that La Salle was lost and did not plan to colonize Texas. That didn't matter. All they knew was that the French had arrived in East Texas, and they needed to do something to show them that they weren't welcome there. In early 1690, De Leon and Massonet, along with about 100 soldiers, built the first mission in East Texas. It was called San Francisco de las Tejas. The Spanish eventually would build 7 or 8 other missions in the area. It is believed that the San Francisco de las Tejas was built near present-day Weches, Texas. Anyways, going back to De Leon, during his trip east, he found the remains of Fort St. Louis, and he met the 4 Frenchmen that had abandoned the fort and went to live with the Indians. It was those 4 Frenchmen that told De Leon what happened and how the expedition had failed to find the Mississippi River. 2 of the Frenchmen would stay with the Indians, while 2 went to join De Leon's party that returned back to Mexico. After De Leon learned the truth about what happened with La Salle and Fort St. Louis, he decided to return back to Mexico. In 1693, the Spaniards that were occupying San Francisco de las Tejas decided to go ahead and abandon it. And the reason why they decided to abandon it was there was a drought going on. They couldn't grow crops. There was disease, and the Indians were not cooperating with them on wanting to learn Christianity or learn farming techniques from them. So eventually, the Spaniards decided the mission was a failure. They burned it and returned back to Mexico. Interesting, though, the other missions and presidios would remain in East Texas. And so the positive thing that the La Salle expedition did was it forced Spain to look at East Texas and to sell it. This would come into play when the old San Antonio Road was established, and forts and presidios started to be established along that road. The La Salle expedition was not meant to threaten Texas. It was meant to try to colonize the lower Mississippi River. Well, in 1699, the French did mean to try to threaten Spanish Texas, and so they established a colony in the southern portion of the Mississippi River where La Salle meant to do it. The French weren't interested in taking Indian territory or converting them to Catholicism as the Spanish did. All they wanted to do was to trade with them. And also, they wanted to look at expanding territory westward into Spanish territory. They didn't want so much to invade. They just wanted to slowly take land, especially unoccupied land, away from the Spanish as they could. The French made large profits by exchanging certain items such as blankets and guns and wine for furs and skins with the Indians. The Indians liked trading with the French, because the Spanish would not give them wine and guns, whereas the French didn't care, and they gave them whatever they wanted. Another thing was the French didn't try to force them to live in missions as the Spanish did. So, put it in a mild way, to the Indians, the French were cool. The Spanish were the hard ones to get along with. The French had also hoped to trade with some of the Spanish merchants in the area, but Spanish law forbid Spanish merchants from trading with foreign agents within the Spanish colonies. This might have been kind of an attempt to try to protect Spanish commerce so that their merchants didn't go bankrupt from foreign agents. Father Hidalgo, who was living in the area, asked France to establish a mission among the Texas Indians. He was hoping that he didn't matter it was a French mission or Spanish mission, as long as it was a Catholic mission, they could help to convert the Indians to Christianity. Well, the French saw this as a possibly an opportunity to trade with other Indians and with the Spanish, and so the French sent an agent, Louis Saint Denis, to Mexico to negotiate with the Spanish about building a mission there. Well, as the French delegation got near the Rio Grande, they approached the mission, the San Juan Bautista mission, and the military that was established there wasn't expecting the French to show up, and so they thought, "Oh my God, this is an invasion, or these are spies," and so they quickly arrested them. They took Saint Denis into custody and sent him down to Mexico City. He was able to convince them what it was his intentions were, and so they released him, and he accompanied the Spanish back to East Texas. So one of the problems between the Spanish and the French was where the boundaries were between the French and Spanish territories in Texas and Louisiana. So the French claimed that the western boundary to their territory was the Sabine River, and the Spanish were claiming that it was the Red River, which ran in the middle of Louisiana. And so there was kind of a gray area in between there. And so the French would act first to claim that territory by establishing the township of Natchitoches and building a fort there, Fort Saint Jean Saint Baptista, in 1714. Well, 5 years later, the Spanish would respond by building a mission there, near about 1350 miles to the west of Natchitoches, called Los Adayas. Well, it was a little too close for the French comfort, and so shortly after it was established, French soldiers went to close it down. And so as the French soldiers approached, and so what was happening was back in Europe, France and Spain was in a war. And so French authorities in North America ordered French soldiers to attack Spanish settlements in the area. And so the French in Natchitoches decided to attack the nearby Los Adayas mission that the Spanish occupied. So a contingency of soldiers was sent to Los Adayas. And as the soldiers got there, they found that the Spanish had gone out for the day, and that only a handful of Spaniards were in the mission at the time. And so the French decided to make the most of it, and they tried to steal whatever they could. Well, one of the things that they tried to steal was chickens. And so as they were riding out, the chickens started flapping and squawking and freaking out. And so it spooked the French horses, and they ran off. A priest that was in the mission saw all this and ran to find that the group of Spaniards that were outside of the mission and tell them what was happening. Well, the Spaniards they packed everything up out of the mission and they left, and they didn't return to Los Adayas for another 2 years. So in a way, the French won because they had managed to get the Spanish to abandon the mission and leave it, but it wasn't really a battle. It was just really a raiding party is what it was. And so it came to become known as the Chicken War because of the theft of the chickens and all the squawking they did, and the fact that it convinced the Spanish to close the mission there. So 1721, the Spanish returned to reestablish Los Adayas, and again it was 13 miles from Natchitoches. This time, though, besides the mission, they built a Presidio there, and it was meant to keep the French out out of the New Spain territories, and was also wanted to bring Christianity to the Catos Indians in the area. The Spanish wanted to make a statement to the French about this territory being theirs, and so Los Ideas was given the title of being the capital of Tejas in the northeastern frontier of New Spain for roughly 41 years, from 1729 to 1770. Although Los Ideas didn't really succeed in converting Indians or really establishing much of a Spanish presence in the area, it did provide enough presence there to convince the French not to move westward anymore. And so Los Ideas mission in Presidios was joined by 400 Spanish citizens that wanted to go out there and take advantage of the pristine land. Unfortunately, they weren't able to really make much things happen there, and so they relied a lot on the nearby French for their survival, essentially. So it's kind of ironic. They were there to keep the French out, but they needed the French to help them to survive up there. So now we're going to head down into central Texas and talk about San Antonio. And so the site where San Antonio was on the San Pedro River had been inhabited by the Indians for thousands of years. It was an ideal spot to locate a village on. A lot of water, great land for farming, a lot of wildlife, and so the Indians loved the location there. And so the site of San Antonio was first explored by the Spanish in the year 1691, and again in the year 1709. And so the Spanish, when they were looking at it, they said that the rivers would be a great way to set up some aqueducts that could be used to run water out to the fields to be irrigated. And so they said also they thought that this would be a great place to set up a settlement so that people traveling on the old San Antonio Road would have somewhere to rest and to trade when they were traveling on there. And also from a military point of view, the terrain of San Antonio made it an ideal defensive position. So the Spanish went ahead and wanted to act on building a Spanish presence there on the San Pedro River, and in 1718 their first mission was built. By the 1700s, the permanent Indian residents of San Antonio missions were speaking Spanish, and they were living as devoted Catholics, and even intermarrying with the local Hispanics nearby. Other Indians in the area saw the success their cousins were having, and so they decided to move there and also interact with the Spanish and receive Christian instructions from them. So the settlement of San Antonio first started off with its first mission, San Antonio de Valero, which was completed on May 1st, 1718. From 1718 through 1731, 4 of the missions were built there, along with the Presidio in the official township of San Fernando de Bear. And so San Antonio offered a lot to its citizens, and not only to its citizens, but to people that were traveling through there and people that went to San Antonio to trade and do business there. And so because of the geographical location of San Antonio, it became an important economic and social center in Texas. It was located along the old San Antonio Road. It was located halfway between the missions along the Rio Grande and the missions in northeast Texas, and it was kind of economically centered in the middle of all of Texas. And so it kind of became unofficially the capital of Texas. But then later on, in Mexican Texas, it would become the official capital of Texas, and where the governor would be seated. And so San Antonio just became an ideal location for helping to permanently settle the area that we now know as Texas. Here's a slide that shows the 5 missions that still stand in San Antonio. One of the things that helped to establish San Antonio as a big permanent settlement in Texas was the introduction of the Canary Islanders to its population. In 1719, the King of Spain was given a report that suggested, hey, why don't we relocate foreign families from the Canary Islands to San Antonio de Bear. And so in July 1830, foreign families were taken from volunteered to be taken from the Canary Islands and arrived at Veracruz, Mexico, which is east of Mexico City. They marched west from Veracruz to Mexico City, and then they decided to march up along the Sierra Madres mountain ranges up to the San Juan Bautista mission. From there, they went the 150 miles to San Antonio, and they arrived in San Antonio March 9th, 1730, almost a year from when they left Mexico City. One of the things that they quickly forged families in San Antonio and businesses. They got along with the population in San Antonio, and they became a huge part of that settlement. One of the things that they're credited with was they held some of the first civil elections in Texas were held after the arrival of the Canary Islanders in San Antonio. And so it was a very positive thing for the foreign families of Canary Islanders to go to San Antonio. And even today, it's a very proud thing to say that I'm a descendant of a Canary Islander. And there's even genealogy societies established to help people celebrate that their ancestry. This slide shows some of the celebration that San Antonio has of the Canary Islanders. There's associations to help people celebrate that. And then there's yearly festivals where people dress up in period costumes and celebrate their Canary Islander heritage. So we talked about the first mission built in Texas. Now we're going to talk about the last official mission built in Texas. And that was Nuestra Senora del Refugio in 1793. It was established to try to Christianize the Karankawas, and it was located near the city of present-day Refugio. In 1805, the surrounding missions were closed, although they were closed because they were unsuccessful in Christianizing the local Indians. The few remaining Karankawas that were willing to try to receive Christian instructions was transferred to the Nuestra Senora del Refugio mission. The mission did succeed in converting some of the Karankawas to Christian ways. And it lasted for about 37 years, and in 1830 it was abandoned. 6 years later, in 1836, it would be the site of a battle in the Texas Revolution called the Battle of Refugio, which we'll cover when we cover the Texas Revolution. This slide shows a map of North America and where the European powers had claimed territory there. This was in 1750 when the English landclaves were starting to come along, and the colonies were starting to form. You can see in the middle, in Louisiana, the French had established a number of forts along the middle of what is now the United States. If you notice, a lot of the forts are located in close proximity to the Mississippi River. And then to the left of the map, you'll see where the Spanish had a lot of missions and presidios. And so this pretty much gives you an idea of where European settlement of North America was in the 1750s. So previously I was talking about the old San Antonio Road and how missions and settlements were established along there. So the old San Antonio Road was kind of the first official highway in Texas. But it wasn't actually like a well-built road like we think today. It wasn't a clear pathway or have bricks or anything along it. It really essentially was a network of trails, and it connected settlements, missions, and presidios. There were smaller feeder roads, smaller trails that went to the old San Antonio Road that helped to connect more missions and settlements to this main pathway. And so it took years to build to establish Old San Antonio Road. What I mean by establish it was from San Bautista mission down down in Mexico up to Los Aldeas mission up in near Natchitoches. So the San Antonio Road, because it connected pretty much the Spanish settlements from Mexico to Louisiana. It became a very important settlement. It became a very important roadway for moving supplies and people through Texas to the different missions and presidios there. Here's another map showing the old San Antonio Road and how long it was. And again, we say the old San Antonio Road. It was really just essentially a number of trails. And the trails, they would have markers. They would have things to help navigation along. And so that's what made it kind of feel like a roadway. So talking about roadways, this is a map that shows you how well established the New Spain was at about the mid mark in the 18th century. You can see it goes all the way up to San Francisco and California, and then all the old San Antonio Road and the feeder roads in San Antonio in Texas. What's interesting, northern New Mexico seemed to be a prize for the Spanish, especially with all the minerals that were found there. But it only had one established road, whereas in Texas you had different roads that went all sorts of different directions. You would think in New Mexico there would be all sorts of roads all around there, but they only had one. One thing to notice about all the roads, whether it was through Texas, New Mexico, or California, they all come down and meet up to one road that went to Mexico City. And again, that goes back to show that power and decisions were centralized, and all came from Mexico City. So remember, in the prehistoric history lecture, we talked about how the Apaches were wanting to attack everybody. They hated everybody, and everybody hated the Apaches. Well, in 1749, the Apaches went to the Spanish and wanted to make a peace deal. And so they made a peace deal in San Antonio. And the Apaches, they were asking for some protection from their enemies, mainly the Comanches. And they also said, hey, we're interested in Christianity. Build us a mission in West Texas, and we'll look at converting to Christianity. What some historians believe was that the Apaches were hoping that to get the Spanish on their side and help them fight against the Comanches. Well, the Spanish were kind of leery about the Apaches because they've been fighting them for so long, and they didn't know whether or not the Apaches would really honor the deal. But the Spanish wanted to Christianize the Apaches in the hopes that they could kind of tame West Texas so that they could have a road between San Antonio and Santa Fe. So in 1757, the Spanish honored their deal and established Mission Santa Cruz de San Saba out near present-day Menard. Later on, they would build the Presidio San Luis de los Amarillos out there. And so the Apaches, though, as usual, didn't honor their end of the deal. No Apache showed up to occupy the mission or to receive Christian instruction. There was a glimmer of hope for the Spanish when 3,000 Apaches stopped by their camp. But what the Apaches were doing, they were moving on up to hunt buffalo up on the high plains in the Panhandle, and they were only stopping there for the camp for a while so they could move on. One of the things too about the Presidio there, the Apaches weren't too impressed with it because the Spanish only assigned 100 soldiers to it, and they felt like this wasn't adequate protection for the Apaches or for the mission itself against a tribe like the Comanches. Well, on March 16, 1758, what the Apaches said came true. A group of about 2,000 Comanches, along with some allies like the Tejas, the Tonkawas, the Wichitas, the Caddos, and the Hasinai warriors, rode about a couple hundred miles from north and east Texas and surrounded the mission there in San Saba. And so they were looking for the Apaches. They were looking to attack the Apaches. Apparently, the Apaches, even though they made peace with the Spanish, they were still attacking the other tribes. And so the other tribes got mad, and they all got together, and they rode hundreds of miles down to central Texas to find their enemy. They found this mission. They surrounded it. And what was ironic was they were armed with French guns and swords and lances while they were riding Spanish horses. The priests came out. They tried to appease them with gifts and whatnot. The Indians were impressed. The Spanish went in, locked the gate, but the Indians were found a way to open the gate, and so they went in. They killed the priests, 2 priests, 4 soldiers, and 2 mission residents there, and they looted the place, and then they burned it to the ground. The Presidio nearby, they saw what was happening, but they couldn't send an effective force against 2,000 Indians to really save the mission. So they stayed inside the Presidio and were not able to help San Saba. It should be noted that this was the only mission in Texas that was completely destroyed by the Native Americans, though they did not attack the Presidio nearby. After this, the idea for a mission in San Saba was abandoned. The Presidio was abandoned, and so they moved back to other settlements. In 1759, the Spanish would retaliate against the Comanches for this attack on San Saba. 600 Spaniards went on an expedition through North Texas, finding the Comanches. They managed to kill 50 Comanches and capture 150 of them, but they were stopped when they reached a Wichita village that was heavily defended. That ended the Spanish expedition, and they felt like that they got their revenge for what happened in San Saba. The pictures on the right is the remains of the Presidio that was there in 1758. So we talked about the missions, we talked about the Presidios. There was some 5 major settlements that would help establish a Spanish presence in Texas, and it would eventually have an impact on the Republic of Texas and modern day Texas as well. And so usually these settlements had a number of missions and Presidios around them, and so they wound up becoming major social and economic centers for Spanish Texas. And so we already talked about the El Paso del Norte in 1680, the San Antonio de Bear in 1718, 3 new ones that we'll talk about: the La Bahia, Goliad, which is now the town of Goliad, in 1749, Laredo in 1755, and Nacogdoches in 1779. Here's a map of where those locations are. If you notice, El Paso del Norte is located along the El Camino Road, and the other ones are located along the Old San Antonio Road. So as I said, we've already talked about El Paso del Norte, and we already talked about San Antonio de Bear, and we're going to go ahead and talk about the other 3 in the following slides. So the first one I want to talk about, La Bahia, which is also called Goliad today. Its official name was the Presidio Nuestra Señora de Loreto de la Bahia. The Presidio La Bahia, which means Fort on the Bay, and Our Lady of Loreto Chapel, located nearby, was constructed in 1721 near La Salle's doomed Fort St. Louis. In 1726, it was abandoned because of troubles with the Karankawas. It was moved 26 miles westward along the Guadalupe River, nearby present-day Victoria, Texas. Presidio La Bahia itself was built of quarry stone, and to try to protect itself from Indian raids. For the next 26 years, the La Bahia mission in Presidio prospered, and it enjoyed successful farming, cattle ranching, and it was able to supply other missions around it from its successful bounty. In 1749, the Presidio mission were again moved to its present location, which was about 100 miles southeast of San Antonio. In time, a civic settlement grew up around the Presidio mission in La Bahia, or Goliad, if you want to call it that. Because of its geographical location, it became an important stop for supplies moving into Texas. For one, it was located near the Gulf of Mexico, so people that traveled by sea, when they landed in Texas, they could travel inland to La Bahia and stop there, and they could figure out which way they needed to go along the El San Antonio Road to get to their destination. And so, like we said earlier, it was a successful. It had successful farming and ranching, and so it had a lot of provisions to give. And so, in a way, one way to think of La Bahia is kind of like with a Buc-ee's for travelers traveling on that part of the old San Antonio Road. It was actually that part of the old San Antonio Road was called the La Bahia Road, and so it was an offshoot of the old San Antonio Road. But there was different ways to connect La Bahia Road to the old San Antonio Road. In 1836, during the Texas Revolution, it would become the site of the Goliad Massacre, where over 400 Texans were killed. Here's a map of the La Bahia Road, and so it was the La Bahia offshoot of the old San Antonio Road. The Laredo is interesting because it was a settlement that was established without a mission or presidio nearby. Laredo was a settlement before there was a mission or presidio built there. And so in 1755, Tomas Sanchez was asked for and was given permission to build a settlement on the north shore of the Rio Grande. And it was named Laredo after the township of Laredo, Spain, back in Iberia Peninsula. At the time, it was part of the New Spain region, Nuevo Santander. So it wasn't called Texas back then. As different administrations came through New Spain, they called different regions new names. And at the time, Laredo was there was a small region called Nuevo Santander in the southern portion of Texas. And so, as I said earlier, it was interesting because Laredo became a settlement before there was a Spanish mission or presidio built nearby. And so, in 1760, they would get a chapel, but it wouldn't be a mission. It would be a place that was held by a position that was held by a secular priest who did provide instructions to the Indians nearby, but it wasn't meant to be a mission like the other ones were. And so it was an ideal location on the Rio Grande because it was an easy place to ford the river. In 1767, the Indians would come to trade there and also to receive religious instruction. Laredo welcomed the Indians and even set some land aside for them to camp on and to do whatever they needed to do when they stayed in Laredo. Laredo's population grew steadily over the years. In 1757, 2 years after it was established, it had 85 people living there. 10 years later, it had 185, and about 22 years later, it had 708 people living there, including 111 Carrizo Indians. In 1783, Laredo got its first public school established. And so Laredo, what was interesting, the town of Laredo didn't have Presidio, but it also didn't have any problems with the Indians. They traded with them, they gave them religious instruction, and got along great with them. But as Laredo grew, as the settlement grew, and became an important economic center, the ranches and the haciendas nearby started to grow, and with that, they got more heads of cattle and more heads of horses. Well, the Indians started to notice that, especially the Comanches and Apaches, and so they started to raid these haciendas to steal the horses and the cattle. So because of this, because Comanche dispatchers were raiding, now Laredo needed protection. So in 1775, a Presidio was built there in Laredo. In the coming Mexican and Texan revolutions, Laredo became an island of royalist sentiment. It stayed loyal to the Spanish crown, and then when the Mexican government took over, it remained loyal to them and refused to join the Texan Revolution on the side of the Texians. The third settlement we'll talk about is Nacogdoches. The area of Nacogdoches was first inhabited by the Caddo Indians for hundreds of years. As we talked about earlier, the Salle Expedition and the establishment of Fort St. Louis brought that area of Texas to the Spanish attention. Around 1700, the Spanish began establishing missions in and around the area of Nacogdoches. But when I say the area of Nacogdoches, I'm talking about where the present city is now. There was no settlement established there at the time. And so when Saint Denis, when he went down to Mexico, was arrested, and then he escorted Spanish authorities back up there, one of the things he did was he helped mark a trail system through that area, helping to establish the old San Antonio Road from the Rio Grande to Louisiana, and it went by where the Nacogdoches is today. So Nacogdoches, there was a mission that was built there, and it was a temporary mission, and so it was abandoned. But the buildings still kind of remained there, and so off and on, the Spanish would occupy it up until 1772. Finally, as y'all have heard about the Louisiana Purchase and all that stuff, and so that area of the Louisiana Purchase was owned by the Spanish and French before it was given to the United States. And so when Spain had gained control of Louisiana in the late 1700s, the Spanish didn't worry about the French anymore, and so they didn't worry about the settlements up there too much, and so they ordered all the Spaniards to leave northeast Texas and head back down to San Antonio. Well, some of the settlers that were up there liked Nacogdoches, they liked the area, and so they petitioned to return back to that area of the Nacogdoches settlement. And so in 1779, the Spanish authorities gave them permission to return. And so officially now, they returned and established a settlement called Nacogdoches. And they were led by a guy named Gil Ibado. And so he kind of became the leader, the first mayor of Nacogdoches, if you will. And so he built an old stone, the old stone house, and it kind of became the center of town. It was a store. It was a place where local government met. It was a boarding house, and so it kind of became everything Nacogdoches. And so it was burnt down, but there's a replica that's built today. I think it's on the SF Austin campus. Here's a map showing where Nacogdoches is. With this slide, I wanted to give you kind of a snapshot of the population of Spanish Texas in 1804. And the reason why 1804 was picked was because that was when a complete census data was done for Spanish to get an idea of what their population was in Texas. And the reason why they wanted to know this was that after the Americans had purchased the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, they were worried about an aggressive American presence outside of their borders. So they wanted to see what assets they had in Texas to offset that. And so the total they came up with was 3,605, which did not include the Indians. They found out also that a vast majority of the Spanish living up there were cattle ranchers and small farmers. And so this is what kind of early Texas looked like for the Spanish. The next couple of slides, we're going to talk about the local governments in Spanish Texas, and really in New Spain. And so, now keep in mind, most of the major decisions remained in Mexico City, and then the decision went out to the territory to be enacted. The local governments kind of ran things, the day-to-day operations of the settlements that they were in charge of, and so the first, the main portion of a local government was called the Ayuntamiento, and it was the principal governing body of Spanish municipalities. And to think of it in today's terms, it's what we would call a city council. And so it was made up of council members called regidors, and it was made up of the town attorney called Syndico Procurador. Now, one thing to remember is that this was not a democratic institution. They weren't voted in. Most of the time, these were landholders, and they were probably the more successful ones. And so they kind of got together and ran the towns as they thought it should be run. Many offices were inherited or sold until the Constitution of 1812, Constitution of Cadiz, called for the popular election of the ayuntamientos by the general population. The next tenet of local government I want to talk about is the alcalde. And the alcalde was like the mayor today, but he had a little more authority. He was more or less like the sheriff and the mayor. And so he, besides being part of the city council, he also could arrest and punish violators. And so he could kind of act like a dictator. He could do whatever measures he deemed necessary to protect the settlement, the city that he was in charge of. Even though he could act like a dictator, sometimes the ayuntamiento could overturn his decisions if enough votes were taken against him. And so, but it was an important position to hold, and usually someone of a strong leadership qualities held this position. So real fast, the ayuntamiento was a group of city council people, and the city council people were called the regidors. And so 4 to 12 regidors would make an ayuntamiento. And usually the position was sold to the highest bidder. One requirement to be in a regidor was that you had to be a landowner in the town that you were a council member of. And even though there was no formal duties that a regidor had to do, they did oversee raising of taxes. They oversaw agriculture, and they could serve as a jury and the judge in trials, civil and criminal trials. And so in 1793, there was an attempt to try to more normalize this relation. But for the most part, regidors were the city council people, and they did have important positions in local government. So the last position I want to talk about is Syndico Procurador. He essentially was the city attorney of a Spanish municipality. And so he was a voting member of the Ayuntamiento. What was interesting was the regidors elected who the city attorney was. And so he kind of had some duties spelled out for him. He notarized, he made sure that documents were notarized so they could become official. He had a role in public security, and he was also chief legal counsel to the mayor and to the city council members. I put on there that he did not vote at meetings, but he was a voting member of the Ayuntamiento. So ignore that last portion where it says he did not vote at meetings. So the last thing I want to talk about is the Spanish caste system in New Spain. And so because the Spanish were European and they practiced the monarchy form of government, there was a caste system put in place. For the purpose of this class, we will look at the 3 main positions that define the new caste system in Spain. The first one was the Peninsulars, and these were Spaniards that were born in Spain to a Spanish to a Spanish mother and a Spanish father. There was the Criollos that were Spaniards born to Spanish mother and Spanish father, but they were born in Mexico, also known as New Spain. And then you had the Mestizos, which were people of mixed ethnicity, where one parent would be a Spanish and one would be Indian, and they were and so they were called mestizos for being mixed ethnicity. There was also some other positions, Indios, pure Indians, the Negros, which were the African slaves that were brought over. But for the purposes of the class and for this instruction, we're just going to look at the Peninsulars, the Criollos, and the Mestizos. So the first one is the Peninsular. And in New Spain, a Peninsular was a resident of the New World born on the Iberian Peninsula. Obviously, a Peninsular was favored over Criollo. And so Peninsulars, they held higher positions on the social scale. Peninsulars, um, they didn't like to. All the power was around Mexico City, as we stated earlier. All the decisions were made at Mexico City. So Mexico City was a very, very important place in New Spain. It was the important place in New Spain. And so if you were a Peninsular, you wanted to be around Mexico City. So they wanted to be around Mexico City. They didn't want to be on the frontier. And so for the most part, they held positions around Mexico City, and the Criollos held positions out on the frontier. Sometimes it was so important to be a Peninsular that a Spanish mother, when she was usually like 2 or 3 months pregnant, would board a Spanish ship to go back to Iberia to give birth to the baby, so it could be a Peninsular, and then she would return back to New Spain with her Peninsular baby. So the next one is the Criollos, and so it was funny because it was a Criollo was a Spaniard born of a Spanish mother, Spanish father, but born in the New World in Mexico. And so you could have a brother that was born in Iberia in Spain, and and then have a brother of the same family that was born in Mexico, and they wouldn't be equal. Their brother born in Iberia would hold higher positions than the brother that was born in Mexico. And so that was what it was about. And so the Criollos couldn't find really good positions around Mexico City. Where they ruled the roost was out in the frontiers. And so they were willing to go out there in the Presidios, in the missions, in the settlements, and hold important positions out there. And so the Mestizos also were out in the frontier, and slowly the line between being a Criollos and a Mestizos kind of eroded. And so even though Criollos were technically higher than Mestizos, that wasn't always the case, and it wasn't always adhered to, especially out on the frontier. Peninsulars had a tendency to be like the CEOs of a company. They would be in the top management positions. Criollos and Mestizos would be in mid and lower management positions. So the Criollos and Mestizos seem to do well in military and civil appointments. And they also seem to do well in church positions. The Peninsulars seem to do well in positions that were appointed by the monarch or the viceroy of New Spain. So the last part of the caste system we'll talk about is the Mestizo. And so the Mestizo was born of one Spanish person and one Indian person. And so they held the middle to lower parts of society. As we said earlier, the line between Criollos and Mestizos started to fade a little bit. And so as far as like legal standings, the Mestizos kind of had mixed legal standings in society. I think it really depended on where they were. If they were out on the frontier, they didn't have to worry about it. But if they were, if they moved closer to Mexico City, then it probably got harder for them to enjoy full legal status as the Peninsulars and the Criollos did. As imagined, the Mestizos started to become the largest segment of the population. The interesting thing was that the Mestizos were allowed to acquire property, and so they weren't totally shunned out as expected. But there would be a lot of friction caused by the legal standing that they had in society, whether they had it or they didn't have it, which would later on lead to the Mexican Revolution in 1810. And this concludes this portion of the Spanish Texas of our Texas history class.